The higher we soar, the smaller we appear to those who cannot fly.
Imagine this. You walk into a room full of people, friends, colleagues, strangers, even enemies. And without even thinking, you begin to adjust yourself. Your posture, your voice, your facial expressions. You edit your presence. You shrink in some places, inflate in others. You rehearse lines in your head that sound like I didn't mean it like that. I was just trying to help. Let me explain. And for a moment you don't notice it, but your soul does. It feels like a quiet betrayal, like you've just handed over a part of yourself to be weighed, measured, and judged in someone else's court. Why do you do this? You weren't born explaining yourself. You were born screaming. You were born demanding to be heard with no shame, no need to justify. And somewhere along the line that got trained out of you, somewhere someone taught you that silence was suspicious and that being misunderstood was dangerous. That unless you performed your intentions like a stage play, people might think the worst of you. So you became a clarifier, a defender, a pleaser. But here's the paradox. The more you explain yourself, the less people understand you. The more you justify your word, the more worthless you feel. The more you open yourself to be seen, the more invisible you become. Have you ever noticed that the people who hold the most power don't explain? They speak with finality. They walk away without guilt. They do not negotiate their character in the marketplace of opinion. You try to be good, to be clear, to be kind. You write the paragraphs of your soul in the sand only for waves of misunderstanding to erase them again and again. And each time you write it again, slower, louder, more carefully, still it disappears. Why is it that silence unnerves people more than explanation? Why is it that restraint is mistaken for arrogance but apology is mistaken for weakness? You feel it when someone twists your intentions, when they distort your meaning and hang your words by the neck in front of others. And the temptation is strong, so strong to shout, "That's not what I meant." But the moment you do the balance tips, you lose something, not just power, but peace. Because here's the truth no one wants to say aloud. Power does not explain itself. The sun does not justify why it shines. The lion does not hold a press conference after a roar. The mountain does not apologize for being hard to climb. So why is it fear? Fear of being misjudged, excluded, rejected? Or is it pride, wishing to be seen as right, noble, pure? Or maybe it's loneliness. A wish to be fully understood, and the desperation that maybe, just maybe, if you explain yourself enough times in the right words, someone will finally get it. But they won't. Not because you aren't clear, but because they've already decided. People don't see you as you are. They see you as they are. Their perception is not your reflection, it's their projection. And still you contort yourself, hoping to fit into a shape that can't exist. Tell me, how many hours of your life have you spent explaining what you meant, what you felt, what you intended? How many relationships have been built on the sandcastle of endless clarification? And how many times have you left those conversations feeling hollow? You think you're building bridges, but some people light fires the moment you turn your back. You think you're being noble, but nobility needs no defense. You think explaining yourself brings peace, but peace doesn't beg to be believed. What if instead you stopped? What if you allow the silence to speak for you? What if you stop letting your value depend on their understanding? What if you learned not to respond, but to withdraw? With dignity, with quiet, with power. Nietzsche once wrote, He who has a why to live can bear almost any how. But what if your constant explanations are keeping you from finding that why? What if your voice always offering proof is the very reason you can't hear your own truth? Have you ever asked yourself, who am I trying to convince, them or me? What happens when you no longer need anyone to get it? When your silence becomes your sword? When does justification become a cage? When does the performance become the prison? And what if power, real unshakable power, begins not with shouting to be understood, but with the quiet decision not to care? Because here's the haunting question you must ask yourself. What would your life look like if you stopped explaining yourself? What happens then? Now, let's go deeper. It begins earlier than you think. You weren't always a prisoner of explanation. You weren't born pleading for understanding. You learned it slowly through the 1,000 tiny violations of your being that no one ever noticed. You showed your joy when someone mocked it. You spoke your truth, someone weaponized it. You made a mistake, someone turned it into a story about who you are. And you began to flinch, not physically, not noticeably, but deep inside a small fracture opened in the foundation of your identity. You stopped showing the full shape of your thoughts. You became careful, and then eventually you became afraid that to be misunderstood was to be unloved, afraid that to be silent was to be erased, afraid that if you didn't explain, defend, clarify, contextualize, you would disappear into the void of other people's assumptions. That's the hidden wound. You began to believe that your existence required permission, that your value needed witnesses, that without their nod, their applause, their approval, you were nothing but an echo in a cold, indifferent room. But here's the philosophical rot beneath the surface. You have mistaken being heard for being real. And that's where the trap lies. Friedrich Nietzsche, sharp and merciless in his understanding of the human condition, warned against this disease of dependency. In Do Spoke Zarathustra, he declared, "One must learn to be a sponge, lest one perish of thirst. But not all thirst is worth quenching. The thirst for approval is the most poisonous of all. It dehydrates the soul while promising to refresh it." Nietzsche did not speak in the soft, comforting tones of modern self-help. He roared with volcanic clarity that the will to power is not about domination over others, but sovereignty over yourself. And what is sovereignty if not the ability to exist without explanation? He saw long before modern psychology caught up that the need to justify oneself is the clearest symptom of inner fragmentation. It is the voice of a self that does not yet believe in its own authority. So let's dive deeper beneath Nietzsche's words into the depths of the psyche. Carl Jung called this the problem of the persona, the social mask we wear to survive in the world. Your persona is built on adaptation. It learns what earns love, what avoids punishment, what keeps the peace. But the cost of this adaptation is steep. You start believing the mask is you. And every time someone doubts your mask, you feel the need to speak, not to inform, but to defend. This is not communication. This is existential panic. You fear the consequences of being misinterpreted, not because it hurts your ego, but because it threatens your constructed self. And when your self is made of explanations, silence becomes unbearable. The moment you stop talking, you begin to vanish, don't you? But is that true? Or just conditioning? Let's peel back another layer. Arthur Schopenhauer, Nietzsche's predecessor and philosophical rival, believed most human suffering came from our delusions about control, especially control over how others perceive us. He called it the folly of the wheel, the idea that we can bend the world to match our inner vision. But the more we try to explain, the more we encounter resistance, distortion, and rejection, and the pain grows. Why? Because we are not just trying to be understood, we are trying to control how we are interpreted. We want others not only to see us, but to see us correctly. But what if that's not possible? What if understanding is not something you receive, but something you let go of? What if the real power is not being understood, but no longer needing to be? Consider this even in your most articulate moments. Have you ever truly felt understood? Did they get it? Did they feel it? Or did they just nod and smile, hearing your words through the filter of their own projections? Jean-Paul Sartre, the existentialist, put it plainly, hell is other people. But he didn't mean it cruelly. He meant that you are always inevitably distorted in the eyes of others. That to live in the world is to be misread, miscast, misjudged, and still to endure. But most people don't endure. They react, they overcorrect, they dilute, they bleed themselves out, trying to be seen clearly. And in doing so, they become more and more transparent until there's nothing left. This is the hidden problem. You are trying to be real in a hall of mirrors. And every explanation you offer bends your image just a little more. You think you're clarifying, but you're fracturing. You think you're healing, but you're hemorrhaging. You think you're connecting, but you're begging. Because make no mistake, explaining yourself is begging. It is begging for acceptance, for permission, for dignity. And what is dignity if not the refusal to beg? Let's look at it through another lens. Viktor Frankl, the Holocaust survivor and founder of logotherapy, wrote that the search for meaning is the primary drive in human life. But not just any meaning, the meaning you assign, not the meaning others validate. If your sense of meaning is always tethered to other people's understanding, then you are not living, you are performing. And the more you perform, the less you remember what it was ever like to simply be. So here's the truth, raw and unfiltered. The desire to be understood is natural, but the addiction to it is deadly. It's not just a bad habit, it's not just insecurity, it is a psychic dependency that keeps you in chains. It makes you a servant of perception, a slave to interpretation, a hostage of opinion. And the tragedy, most people will never notice the chains. They'll call it kindness. They'll call it humility. They'll call it communication. But Nietzsche saw it for what it is, a subtle form of surrender. Because every time you explain yourself to someone who has already decided who you are whispering, "Your version of me matters more than my truth." And that is the death of the self. So the question becomes, how do you reclaim your silence without becoming cold? How do you detach from others' perceptions without becoming numb? How do you live as a sovereign being in a world that demands a script? We're not there yet, but we're getting close. Now we must look at what happens when this problem goes unnoticed. When you keep explaining, when you keep chasing the ghost of understanding. That's where the damage reveals itself most. Let's descend into it. You don't see it at first. You tell yourself it's harmless. It's just being polite, just being clear, just trying to avoid misunderstandings. But every time you explain yourself, a quiet exchange takes place, one that accumulates over time like emotional debt. Each explanation is a small withdrawal from your inner sovereignty. Each justification chips away at your dignity. Each appeal to be understood sends a subtle message to your unconscious, "I am not enough on my own." And this is how the erosion begins, At first it's barely noticeable. You feel slightly off after certain conversations, maybe a little drained, a little irritated, a little disconnected from yourself. You brush it off, but then it happens again and again and again. You begin to feel perpetually exposed, like your entire being is always on trial. And in many ways it is. Because once you become addicted to explaining yourself, you become addicted to managing perception. And when perception becomes your god, your life becomes a courtroom. Every room you enter is a jury box. Every sentence you speak is evidence. Every silence is suspect. It's no longer enough to be. You must be understood correctly, constantly. You become your own public relations firm, spinning stories, crafting narratives, correcting interpretations, and here is the unseen consequence: you lose your center. You begin to live from the outside in. Instead of asking, "What do I know to be true?" you start asking, "How will they take this?" Your thoughts are no longer free. They're drafted for approval. Your emotions no longer flow naturally. They're processed, filtered, formatted for readability. Even your presence, the way you stand, speak, breathe, gets revised by this invisible editor on our head who's always asking, will they get it? Will they like it? Will they still want me? You think you're connecting, but what you're really doing is surviving, and survival always comes at a cost. Let's talk about that cost on the personal level and the collective one. Personal cost, psychic fragmentation. The first thing you lose is clarity, not the clarity of explanation, but the clarity of self. You no longer know where your truth ends and their perception begins. You start doubting your instincts. You have a moment of insight, but before it fully blooms, you're already translating it into someone else's language. By the time it leaves your mouth, it's no longer yours. And over time, this becomes chronic. You no longer trust your own first response. Your inner voice is replaced by an inner committee, loud, anxious, and deeply divided. This leads to a specific kind of fatigue, not just emotional exhaustion, but identity fatigue. You wake up feeling behind on being yourself. Like there's a version of you out there, whole and untamed, that you've lost track of, and you don't know how to find your way back. This is where depression breeds. This is where anxiety thrives, because when your sense of self is contingent on others' approval, you are never safe, not truly. And here's the twist: your efforts to be understood often create the opposite. The more you explain, the more others feel entitled to dissect you. You invite them into the sanctum of your being and then act surprised when they rearrange the furniture. Some people mistake your vulnerability for invitation. Others mistake your kindness for confession. Still others mistake your explanation for weakness, and they respond accordingly. You give them your soul, and they hand you back a diagnosis, a label, a dismissal. Collective cost, a culture of performed authenticity. Now zoom out. We live with a culture addicted to explanation. Social media has turned self-expression into a product. You are taught to brand yourself, narrate yourself, expose yourself in bite-sized clarity to a watching world. Your grief must be eloquent. Your anger must be justified. Your joy must be photogenic. Even your silence must come with a caption: I'm taking time for myself. I'm doing shadow work. I'm setting boundaries. Everything has to be explained. Nothing is allowed to simply be. And so we create a world of curated selves where authenticity is rehearsed and realness is just another aesthetic. This isn't connection, it's surveillance disguised as intimacy. We call it communication. But what it really is confession under pressure. A soft kind of conformity. a psychological panopticon where everyone is both prisoner and guard. And here's where the trap closes in. The more everyone explains themselves, the more explanation becomes expected, and suddenly not explaining becomes a crime, a red flag, a reason to cancel, to exile, to shame. Silence is now suspect, stillness is now arrogance, privacy is now guilt, and so we perform. We perform mental health, we perform growth, we perform boundaries, we even perform rebellion. And what happens to a soul that is always performing? It begins to forget how to rest. It begins to lose the ability to hear its own voice. It begins to rot beneath the polished surface. The deeper neurological trap. There's one more layer, a biological one. Your brain is wired for pattern recognition. It craves coherence. When someone misunderstands you, it triggers a mild but real threat response. Your amygdala interprets it as danger. They don't get me. I might be unsafe. So you jump in to clarify, not from logic but from instinct. But each time you do, you reinforce the same neural loop. You reward your brain for entering the cycle of justification. Over time, this becomes a habit. And like any habit, it begins to define your sense of normal. Eventually, silence feels like suffocation. Stillness feels like erasure. You feel compelled to explain not because it's right, but because it's familiar. And so, even when it no longer serves you, you can't stop. You feel haunted by the need to clarify your thoughts, to account for your emotions, to offer footnotes for your existence. But what you're really haunted by is the absence of self-trust. And if left unchecked, that absence deepens. It becomes the story of your life. This is the unseen consequence of a life spent explaining you disappear. Not all at once, not in some dramatic collapse, but slowly, imperceptibly. You become a ghost of your own soul, visible but not real, present but not whole. And one day you look in the mirror and ask the question Nietzsche feared more than death: was I ever truly here at all? But here's the miracle buried in the horror. If your disappearance was gradual, so can your return be. And that begins not with more noise but with a refusal to justify, a refusal to translate, a refusal to offer yourself up as a thesis to be debated. There is a way back, but it's not easy, it's not comfortable, and it's not safe. It requires rebellion, and rebellion always begins in silence. Now, let's begin the rebellion. You don't reclaim your power by shouting louder. You don't find yourself in another explanation, another well-worded justification, another desperate attempt to be seen correctly. You begin strangely terrifyingly by saying nothing. Silence isn't the absence of noise. It's the presence of something deeper. It's the sacred space where your real self begins to gather piece by piece, away from the eyes of others, away from the noise of performance. It's where the rebellion begins. But to rebel in this way is not what the world expects. They want revolution to be loud, explosive, obvious. This one is not. This rebellion is surgical, philosophical, internal. It's the quietest thing you'll ever do, and the loudest your soul will ever be. So how do you break free? You start by understanding this. You owe no one an explanation for your existence, not for your healing, not for your preferences, not for your silence, not for the way you love or grieve or grow. It is not arrogance, it is autonomy. And autonomy begins with a sacred no. No, I will not explain my silence. No, I will not justify my boundaries. No, I will not translate my intuition into your language. Because here's what no one tells you: every time you explain your boundary, you risk turning it into a negotiation. And boundaries are not doors to be knocked on. They are walls that say, I do not owe you access. Nietzsche wrote of the Übermensch, the one who transcends the herd, who dares to live by their own values, not those inherited or enforced. But most people mistake this as a license for domination. It isn't. It's a call to radical self-responsibility. It means choosing your truth over their comfort. It means disappointing people who demand your compliance. It means being willing to be misunderstood and still refusing to shrink. You must become immune to misinterpretation, not indifferent but immune. There is a difference. Indifference is deadness. Immunity is clarity. You feel the sting of being misjudged. You don't pretend it doesn't hurt, but you no longer run to fix it. You sit with it. You let them believe what they will. You stop editing yourself to fit a story they wrote without your consent, and in that moment, you become free. But freedom has a price. You will lose people. You will lose those who only love the version of you that explained, that softened, that made itself small to keep the peace. You will lose the shallow approval of those who demand your transparency but offer none in return. You will lose the illusion that you are loved because you are understood, and you will grieve. Of course you will. But what you gain? What you gain is irreplaceable. You gain wholeness. You gain the stillness of being alone and not needing to explain why. You gain the power of walking out of a room and not looking back. You begin to see it everywhere now. You notice the people who speak less but are heard more. You see how restraint is mistaken for mystery and how mystery draws the world closer. You realize that when you stop performing, the right people lean in, because silence reveals what explanation hides truth. Here's a hard truth: not everyone deserves access to your internal world. Not everyone is qualified to hear your why, and most of the time, the ones who demand it the loudest are the least capable of holding it with care. So stop giving it to them. Nietzsche said, become who you are. But to do that, you must first stop being who you're not. And who you're not is a spokesperson for your own soul. You are not a press release. You are not a court case. You are a storm, a mountain, a poem written in a language only a few will ever understand, and that's enough. But the modern world tells you otherwise. It tells you that silence is rude, that stillness is laziness, that being misunderstood means you failed. They're wrong. Let them wonder. Let them guess. Let them fill in the blanks with whatever their minds conjure. It's not your responsibility to manage their projections. It's not your duty to walk them through the maze of your interior world, hand in hand, until they nod in agreement. Some things are meant to be sacred. Some things are meant to be yours and yours alone. And if someone misjudges your silence, let them. Their misjudgment is not about you. It's about them, their own fears, their own stories, their own need for control. Let them talk. Let them speculate. Let them circle around the mystery like moths to a flame they will never touch. Because while they talk, you evolve. You rise not with noise, but with gravity. You become the kind of presence that no longer begs to be understood. You become a mystery wrapped in clarity, a riddle that does not need to be solved. This is power. Not the kind that screams, not the kind that dominates, but the kind that walks away. You'll notice something once you begin this rebellion. The quieter you become, the louder the world gets. At first, it's unbearable. You'll feel tempted to return to the noise, to shout your truths into the void again, to reach for the comfort of being seen. Don't. That's the test. That's the threshold. Pass it. Stand in your silence. Let the discomfort refine you. Let the stillness rewire you. Eventually, you'll notice something else. The noise isn't about you. It never was. You were never the center of their confusion, only the screen onto which they projected their own. And once you stop participating in that exchange, once you stop explaining, defending, proving, you create something priceless: space. Space to be misunderstood, space to be judged, space to be free. And from that space, something new will grow. A new kind of speech, a new kind of presence, not from insecurity but from sovereignty. You don't stop explaining because you no longer care. You stop explaining because you finally do. You care enough to protect your energy, to protect your truth, to protect the sacred mystery of who you are becoming. And that mystery, that silence, is the sound of your liberation. Let them talk. You've said enough. Now, it's time for the final truth. You wake up one morning and for the first time in a long time you don't feel the need to prove anything. You sip your coffee slowly. You feel the warmth, the silence, the aliveness beneath the stillness. No audience, no approval, no performance, just you. You realize you don't have to explain why you're quiet, why you changed, why you didn't text back, why you left, why you stayed, why you don't feel the same anymore. You don't have to explain your peace. You finally understand power is not noise. It's not presence. It's not even action. Power is not needing to explain who you are because you finally know. And that is the deepest truth. All your life you thought the goal was to be seen, but the real goal was to see yourself clearly enough that the world's confusion no longer matters. This isn't detachment, this is transcendence. You are no longer asking for reflection, you are radiating from within. You are no longer translating your soul, you are walking in truth. You are no longer narrating your life to make it palatable. You are living it raw and unscripted. This is the moment Nietzsche spoke of, not as a destination, but as a return. A return to your primal state, before you were explained, before you were categorized, before you were broken down into pieces for easier consumption. You are whole now, and in this wholeness something remarkable happens. You stop seeking power, because you've become it, not by grasping, not by fighting, not by convincing, but by doing the thing the world fears most: being silent in your truth. You realize now that explaining was never about connection. It was about fear. Fear of loss, of isolation, of rejection, of misinterpretation. But fear can only rule where truth is not rooted, and your roots run deep now. You look back and see it. All the hours spent clarifying your soul, all the energy wasted fixing their stories about you, all the breath used to earn what should have been given freely. It wasn't worthless. It was initiation. You had to lose your voice to find your silence. You had to be misunderstood to remember that your truth is not fragile. You had to exhaust yourself trying to be seen, so you could finally open your eyes, and what you see now changes everything. You see how most people never actually listen. They hear what confirms their beliefs. They listen for validation, not revelation, and so you stop offering your essence to ears that are closed, not out of anger, not out of bitterness, but out of reverence for yourself. This is the sacred silence Nietzsche hinted at when he said, "He who cannot remain silent will not learn to speak." Because true speech, the kind that shakes the soul, doesn't come from anxiety. It comes from sovereign silence, from knowing that words are precious. That truth doesn't need performance, that your essence doesn't require a narrator, so you speak less, and when you do, The world listens because they can feel it now. They can feel that you are no longer explaining, you are embodying. You are no longer reacting, you are revealing, not for them, not for applause, but because that is what truth does. It radiates. You become untouchable not because you're cold, but because you're centered, unshakable not because you're perfect, but because you are no longer for sale. You are not available for negotiation. Not your values, not your energy, not your story, because you've returned to the source, to the quiet knowing that needs no witness, to the presence that does not plead, to the soul that does not shrink, and from this place, life begins again. You will still be misunderstood. You will still be judged. You will still be seen through foggy lenses. But it won't matter, not like it used to, because now you are no longer trying to escape their projections. You are simply no longer participating in them. You see the dance, you smile gently, and you walk away with no explanation. This is power, the Nietzschean kind, not the loud brash performance of control, but the subtle unwavering gravity of self-possession. It doesn't chase, it doesn't justify, it doesn't beg, it just is, and now, so are you. There will be moments where the old habits return, where you'll feel the urge to say, "That's not what I meant," or "Let me explain," or "Please don't misunderstand." Stop, breathe, smile. You owe them nothing, not because you are better, but because you are free. Free from the illusion that clarity is owed, free from the addiction to approval, free from the burden of being understood. You walk differently now, not faster, not louder, but grounded. They ask you, "Why don't you explain anymore?" You look at them, you pause, and with a calm that rattles their bones you say, "Because I'm no longer trying to convince anyone I exist." Let them talk. Let them wonder. Let them write their stories. You've already written yours, in silence, in truth, in power. And that is the end of explanation.